Hi, my name is Lorenzo Falchi and I work in the lymphoma service at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. I was very happy to be here at HEMO 2023 to talk about immunotherapy in B-cell non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And certainly one of the most exciting advancements in this field is the advent of bispecific antibodies. These are antibody-like structures, molecules, that simultaneously target the CD20 molecule on the target cells, that is the lymphoma cells, and the CD3 molecule on the immune cells, specifically the T cells. And by doing so, they induce very potent cytotoxic killing of the target cell. These drugs were developed first in vitro and obviously then brought into the clinic. And the two studies that I have been discussing are the two registration studies for two of the more promising bispecific antibodies. The first is glofitamab. This is what's called a 2-to-1 bispecific antibodies, where the molecule mounts two CD20 specific moieties and a CD3 specific moiety. This drug is administered intravenously, and it was tested in a variety of B-cell lymphomas. But then the larger study was really conducted in patients with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma in the third-line space. These patients were heavily pretreated and certainly would have had very limited treatment options. And glofitamab was administered on a step-up dosing schedule, which means that patients were first given a mini priming dose, then an intermediate dose, and then the first full dose. After that, the drug was administered every 3 weeks for up to 12 cycles. In that study, patients that were enrolled included patients with all kinds of aggressive CD20 positive B-cell non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and overall 154 patients were enrolled. The response rate was quite promising. 52% of patients had an objective response, and 39% had a complete metabolic response, which we know is a very important marker of long-term success. Overall, close to 40% of patients remained progression-free at a relatively long follow-up, which at the latest presentation was around 18 months. So we think that patients who are no longer treated and in remission 2 years or beyond after the treatment with glofitamab, these patients could probably be considered cured. So we start to think of these treatments as really those with curative potential. A similar study was for another bispecific antibody, which is epcoritamab. This product is a 1-to-1 antibody in that it really only mounts one CD20 positive moiety and one CD3 positive moiety. It is administered subcutaneously, unlike glofitamab, and it also is administered on a step-up dosing schedule for cycle 1, and then it's administered every other week for a number of cycles and eventually every month. But unlike the glofitamab trial, the epcoritamab is administered indefinitely per the package insert until progression or unacceptable toxicity. So we don't really have data on what happens to patients who are in a remission after glofitamab and the drug gets stopped, because that's not really possible per the indication currently. But nevertheless, over 150 patients in that study, very similar response rate, 63% overall response rate, 39% complete response rate. Again, very promising. And both the glofitamab study and the epcoritamab study included about a third of patients who had been previously exposed to CAR T cells. And in those patients, the response rates were not quite as high as the overall population, but still very promising, certainly some of the highest that we've seen in the post-CAR T cell setting in a published report. That offers patients who are at such a high risk for failure and with such a difficult to treat lymphoma hope that previously wasn't there. So I think, overall, the collection of data for bispecific antibodies suggests that this is a really important weapon in the armamentarium for the treatment of patients with very difficult to treat diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, including those who have progressed after CAR T-cell therapy. Now, one of the limitations of CAR T-cell therapy is that this is a very expensive, sophisticated technology that really requires a lot of expertise and resources, and not many centers in not many countries really can easily administer CAR T-cell therapy. So in that particular patient population, when platinum-based chemotherapy and autologous stem cell transplantation or CAR T-cell therapy are not an option, I would say bispecific antibodies are certainly among the most promising treatment options that can still have a high chance of a complete metabolic response and perhaps a significant chance of long-term remission. We're always very cautious in using the word cure, but I think that having patients 3 or 4 years after completion of therapy in remission, particularly referring to the glofitamab data set, really is a key observation that could suggest that some of these patients are indeed cured. So very exciting data. Now obviously the second chapter is to look at mechanisms of resistance to bispecific antibodies. There are a number of studies both in the preclinical and clinical space looking at what could determine resistance to bispecific antibodies. One of the most obvious mechanisms is the loss of the target antigen, that is CD20. Another mechanism is the T-cell dysfunction or T-cell exhaustion that can be induced by bispecific antibody therapy. And then there are other potential mechanisms that are less understood and less clear. And there are a number of studies already in the clinical setting looking at ways to overcome this type of resistance. One of them, for example, utilizes bispecific or trispecific antibodies that target different antigens. CD19, CD79 are only 2 examples. Another strategy uses co-stimulatory bispecific antibodies, which are bispecific antibodies that really target antigens that activate a signaling cascade that boosts or amplifies the activation of T cells and increases the chance of cytotoxic killing. Some of these studies are in the clinical space, as I said. Some preliminary results have already been presented for some of these studies. Some others will be presented at this year's ASH and in future meetings. So I'm very eager to see where the field is going to be going, because I think we're only really scratching the surface of what could be a very, very promising treatment options for patients with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma in a very acute need for life-saving therapies.